Marco Tassati asked Viganò this: why do you see a relationship between the Second Vatican Council and the 1968 student protests? His Excellency Archbishop Viganò responds, it is undeniable, even if only from a historical and sociological point of view, that there is a close relationship between the conciliar revolution, that's Vatican II, and 1968. The very protagonists of Vatican II admit it. Joseph Ratzinger stands out among them, writing, and here Archbishop Viganò quotes Ratzinger. And there's been kind of a, let me just make a comment here. There's kind of a back and forth right now in Catholic discourse, especially when you talk about Vatican II or Archbishop Viganò, over quotes by Ratzinger Benedict. Each side is able to cite proof text showing Vatican II is awesome or Vatican II has problems by citing Ratzinger. Me personally, I think it's a lost cause. I think there's things in Ratzinger that go both ways. But here's a really solid quote from Ratzinger regarding Vatican II that Viganò brings up, and we should all pay attention to it. So here goes. Here's the quote from Ratzinger. Quote, adherence to a utopian anarchistic Marxism was supported on the front lines by university chaplains and student associations who saw it in the dawn of the realization of Christian hopes. The guiding light is to be found in the events of May 1968 in France. Dominicans and Jesuits were at the barricades. The intercommunion carried out at an ecumenical mass at the barricades was considered a kind of landmark in salvation history, a kind of revelation that inaugurated a new era of Christianity, end quote. And we do see this even in the opening address of John the 23rd at Vatican II. We do see this idea that we're entering into a new epoch of humanity and thus Christianity. Now, sadly, this goes back to the warnings of Pope Pius IX and Pope St. Pius X, who warned us of the error of modernism, which is the synthesis of all errors. It's the idea that Catholicism needs to be updated with the times. You got to update. You got to keep it modern. You got to keep the music trendy. You got to keep the vestments trendy. You got to get banners that are trendy. And you might even need to start changing all 7 sacraments to update them for the times. And what do we see now in 2020? We hear of calls in the Vatican for updating even the Novus Ordo. The Novus Ordo now, since 1969, 1970, even it apparently needs to be updated. And this is the error that Pope Pius X warned us about. It's the heresy of modernism. Catholicism doesn't need to be updated or changed with the times. Are there clarifications made over 2,000 years? Yes. Do we use more and more precise terminology to fight heresy? Yes. But do we change the Bible? Do we change the interpretation of the Bible? Do we change the sacraments? Do we change the structure of the church? Do we change the papacy? No, 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 and finally, no. Catholicism in the year AD 33 is identical in faith and morals to Catholicism in 2020. It is perennial. Yes, I know that the church in AD 33 did not recite the Nicene Creed at Mass. I know. But they all believed the content that was in the Nicene Creed. Of course, there are heretics and there are battles, yes. But the apostolic faith has always been preserved in the Catholic Church. It's always been there. There was always someone, bishops and lay people and popes, who believed in the Trinity, who believed that Christ was eternally begotten of the Father, that believed that after the consecration, the bread was no longer bread, but was truly the person Jesus Christ. There was always someone who believed that Our Lady was assumed body and soul in heaven, etc. All the dogmas and doctrines of the faith have always been inside the deposit of faith that Christ gave to the 12 apostles. So it can't be changed. But In the 1960s, modernism went on parade. And so we see all kinds of innovations, including this idea of intercommunion. It's the idea you can get a Lutheran and a Methodist and a Presbyterian, and we all disagree on what Christianity is, but we all receive the Eucharist together. No, we don't. Communion means cum, with, union. With union. We have union of belief in order to be in communion with one another. So the Eucharist, which is Holy Communion, is union with God Almighty through the hypostatic union, Jesus Christ. But it's also union on a horizontal level through that transcendent. The transcendent's primary, of course. So Pope Benedict is saying here that there was this idea of a new Christianity, a new era of Christianity that included this idea of relativism, intercommunion. Then Archbishop Viganò quotes one of the Peretti, the experts at the Vatican II Council, Father René Laurentin. He says, the demands of May 68 movement largely coincided with the Council's grand ideas, particularly in the Council's Constitution on the Church and the World. To a certain extent, Vatican II was already a protest against the Curia by a group of bishops who were trying to create an institutionally prefabricated council, end quote. This is what we mean by deep church. There were many theologians, many bishops who were holding a shadow council, a deep council, and primarily Germans. If you have this book, you should read it. If you don't, you should get it. The Rhine flows into the Tiber, a history of Vatican II. And it shows how the German theologians and the German bishops exerted their power primarily through their prestige with their wealth and also their academic institutions, how they, from the Rhine, flowed their evil ideas into the Tiber, which is the river that runs through Rome, right there along Vatican City. A great book. It's shocking to read, and it shows you that what Viganò is talking about, what Ratzinger is talking about, what all these sources are talking about was a shadow council, a deep church. And it coincides with the revolutionary spirit that we saw manifest in the late 60s. He then quotes another theologian, the Argentinian theologian, Father Alvaro Calderon, who has a very interesting thesis on authority. I read some of it. He states, if there's anything that immediately stands out to those who study the Second Vatican Council, it is the change, in a liberal sense, of the concept of authority. The Pope stripped himself of supreme authority in favor of the bishops, which is what today they call collegiality or synodality. That's kind of the new hot word, synodality. That's what Francis likes. Nope, this way. Here we go. So the Pope stripped himself of supreme authority in favor of the bishops, collegiality. Then the bishops stripped themselves of their authority in favor of theologians. Theologians gave up their science in favor of listening to the faithful. We can think here of the ban on contraception, which has been all the way into the early church. They just said, well, the lay people, they want to use condoms and the birth control pills, so we're just going to have to let that happen. And the voice of the faithful is nothing more than the fruit of propaganda. End quote. And then Viganò makes a comment here. He says, the vision is also widely and profoundly affirmed on the progressive front, which saw the same demands of the conciliar revolution realized in 1968. So Viganò is making an argument here. It's a daring argument. It's been made before. I will say that many people have not ever taken it seriously because they say, look, after the Industrial Revolution, moving into the post-Second World War era, we have women who have been at work. We have the invention of all kinds of things that enable women to leave the home and enter the workforce. These would be, and Jordan Peterson's done an interesting analysis on this. He says that things like the birth control pill, obviously, is important, but also things like brassieres, tampons, and other such things, even clothing, allowed women to have more and more freedom within the world and outside the domestic roles. And this created a certain sexual revolution, a gender revolution. There's also things, after the Second World War, there was a great pessimism, both in the New World and in the Old World in Europe. Sons, fathers, uncles, brothers had been slaughtered. Every family had lost their sons, even some daughters, but mostly sons, in the war. And there was this pessimism. Even my own grandfather, I remember speaking to him saying how he lost his faith during the Second World War. And he said, how could it be that a God would allow a World War II? How horrible it was. He said, you didn't see it with your own eyes. I was there. He was on the Pacific side. So many people lost their faith. So there are all these elements that are leading up to it. But what Viganò is saying, and I'm going to get to this point in a little bit, is that when the Catholic Church, which is the leader in morality and faith, when the Catholic Church, he says, gave the green light to moral ambiguity, and when the Catholic Church says, well, we're not really authoritative anymore. The Pope's not going to wear his triple crown, his tiara anymore. We're going to be more into dialogue and understanding and accompaniment and tolerance and religious freedom. When the world was sort of barreling towards this revolution, that's when the Catholic Church said, well, we're not here to stop you. You be you. And this is the problem.